British Literature in Review. This is my final presentation explaining what I've learned about the three main literary movements in British literature from the 1790s to 1939-ish. The Romantics, from the 1790s to early 1830s. A tale of wild adventures in war and love. Samuel Johnson's Dictionary, 1755. The Romantic Age was one of revolution and turbulence. It has its roots in the American and French Revolution, both eschewing monarch rule and establishing societal standards for something different. The primary issues that defined the age were the issue of women's rights, abolition of slavery, and a growing awareness of class struggle. The writers of the Romantic movement can be split into two generations. The first generation, Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Barbauld, Wollstonecraft, and the second generation, Percy and Mary Shelley, Keats, and Byron. A representative work of the Romantic era is The Mouse's Petition to Dr. Priestley. It's experimental in that the narrator is a non-human, being the mouse, and it questions the ethics of science in that if life is created equal, what gives mankind the power to subjugate non-humans to our wills? It can also be viewed as a metaphor for the disenfranchised, particularly slavery. If all humans are created equal, what gives us the right to enslave others? And it uses the imagination to explore non-established religious truths, such as the ideas that man is superior to woman and that mankind is superior to other life forms. The Victorians, 1832 to 1901. We are living in an age of transition. Sir Howland, 1858. The Victorian age was one of transition, from the old world pre-industrial to one of technological progress. The good values that defined the time was one of physical energy. Writers were said to have walked 20 miles a day and eaten 12-course meals. To put perspective on this, walking from the Elmsall campus to the Arch downtown and back via the Natural Bridge is precisely 20 miles, which would take approximately 6.5 hours at 5 miles per hour, not accounting for stops. The second is the gospel of work. Everyone wanted to work and generally found a sense of accomplishment in the act of working. And the third is a sense of duty to the public good. Awareness was being expended to the lives of lower and middle class people, which helped spur change. Some of the new inventions that helped shape the consciousness of this time was the steam-powered printing press, railways, telegram, journalism, junk mail, chain stores, stamps, illustrated magazines, shampoo, and prototype computer. To imagine that shampoo didn't exist before this time is a little gross. And the ugly side of the Victorian age is the obsession with work as a distraction, presumably from some of the social issues that plagued people, such as the changing gender roles. Gender roles were viewed as something set in stone and not to be questioned, but as we've learned in our modern age, that's not a healthy view, and naturally this would lead to some people having some issues with themselves and their society. And these changing views led to doubts in faith, especially with the advancements of technology, disproving some of the fundamental religious views, or views anyway, that were taken from the Bible literally, and questioning class privilege versus imperial rule. It's an idea of questioning, can people govern themselves, and should they govern themselves? Traits that define the Victorian text. Close thy Byron, open thy Goethe, Carlyle. Some of the traits that define the Victorian text are self-exploration, eccentricity, being long-winded. Seriously, some poems reached into like hundreds of lines, which is obnoxious, honestly. In my personal opinion, poetry should not exceed 20, maybe 40 lines tops, unless you're T.S. Eliot. That's an exception. Earnest, ornate, fantasy, humor, and experimental. Representative works of the Victorian era: The Gospel of Mammonism and Labor. The Gospel questions why it is impossible to treat this woman of lower class who is stricken with fever, and the ignoring of this class struggle led to the death of 17 other men who were of higher class. And overall, this piece has a creepy sense of social Darwinism, saying that if she was of a higher social class, that maybe she would have gotten the treatment she needed and wouldn't have died in the first place. The text of Labor embodies the gospel of work. Work is communication with nature or God. Work done will itself lead to more and more to the truth. One can identify oneself and / find their purpose via work, such as a potter spins and shapes clay. Work shapes the spinning, formless chaos that is the human soul. This continuation of work leads to the continuation of human progress. The Modernists, 1930 to 1939-ish. We live as we dream, alone. Heart of Darkness, Conrad. An era split. The Modernist era from 1900 to 1939 can be split into two literary movements, the Gregorian period and the Modernist proper period. The Gregorian period spans from 1900 to 1914 and is characterized by peace and prosperity and would be looked back on with nostalgia after the outbreak of the war. Then from 1914 to 1939, the Modernists proper period, there is a new sense of urgency to make literature new, to reinvent everything. As Ezra Pound said, make it new. There's a sense of skepticism in that there was a break from the belief that humans were making progress towards a greater good, and that maybe we were just making progress towards our own inevitable end with all the technologies that were being developed and used in the war in various horrifying ways. The end of history and the uncertainty principle. There are three main factors that was affecting literature at this time: philosophy, science, and psychology. Philosophers such as Nietzsche were in the process of reevaluating all values and postulating things like God is dead, meaning that he was questioning whether, if God existed, did God give us a specific purpose, or do we create God, and or do we come here onto Earth without a specific purpose, and we make up our own purpose and make up our own values as we go along. In the scientific realm, Einstein's special and general theory of relativity and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle were starting to pick apart the nature of reality and allowing us to understand on a more fundamental level how space and time works, instead of just accepting reality as a construct created by God or other mythical being. And in the realm of psychology, Freud was pioneering the techniques of psychoanalysis and dream analysis. So for the first time in history, we were starting to question what goes on in the mind and how people are and why people are the way they are, instead of just accepting that people have choices in the way they evolve, and realizing that some of the events that happen in our lives, or sometimes the way our brains work, can hinder or help our functions in society. representative examples of the modernist era. The poem Hap embodies this idea of struggling to find meaning in life when he can't decide the God that is out there is a vengeful or a benevolent God, or whether he even completely rejects the idea of God itself, and that things just casually happen, such as this, such as the clouds blotting out the sun, or rain raining down on you for no particular reason other than that it just is raining. And this idea kind of goes beyond the pale, beyond the idea of a benevolent Christian God to a different god of lowercase g that is maybe one of the pagan gods or one of the Greek gods or something. Then the second poem that represents the modernist era is Dulce et decorum est. The poem itself uses a lot of dreamlike language, almost like stream of consciousness. It refers to men marching to sleep, to dreaming, and even to nightmares that smother you and end up killing you. And there's also a sense of aloneness that when in these trenches, these guys are facing shells and gas and shock alone. There's no sense of camaraderie. It's just everyone's there to survive. And it also questions this, it kind of brings up this idea of questioning historical progress. All these technologies that are referred to, the gas and the shells and things like that, are these things that are possible because of the modern age, but are they being used for good, or are they just being used for our personal undoing? And then there's the poem The Hospital Visitor. And it embodies this idea that Conrad touched on in his story, The Heart of Darkness, that sometimes when people go beyond the pale, out into the fringe, they see things that change them, and they come back not quite the same they were before. This change leads them to an alienation or an inability to connect with others because other people just don't understand what they've seen, what they've gone through, and many times they don't even have the proper words to express it. And due to psychology being so young at the time, it's almost viewed as inappropriate to be so changed or affected by these things, even though some people are trying to understand and empathize with them about where they are in their headspace. I want to conclude my presentation with a quote from our textbook, Masters of British Literature. To be modern has been defined as a persistent sense of having arrived on the stage of history after history has finished. In our modern age, it's easy to believe that we've moved way far past the days of World War I and II, that our age of information and technology has made us somehow superior to the people who went before us 50, 60, 70 years ago. And to some extent, that is true. We have made some progress with women's rights and with interspecial rights, and we've made advances in science and technology and psychology and stuff like that, but we still have a long way to go. And many of the themes that were brought up during the modernist era are still extremely relevant to us today. We still struggle with the prejudices of religion. We're still struggling with the nature of our existence. We're still struggling with even with even something as simple as gender identities. Something the Victorians were starting to question is something that we still haven't quite been able to completely be comfortable with. And for us to think that the postmodernists have surpassed the modernists and that we've made leaps and strides beyond that point in history is frankly foolish. We ourselves stand on the shoulders of those strange and cynical men and women who would, and we would do well not to forget their words. We still have a lot of progress to go, and we very well might be at the end of our history with the global climate change, with the nuclear disasters that go on around us, with the fact that we have armaments that can destroy our planet several times over, and they serve almost no practical use. We stand on the edge of a cliff, and we don't have to ration as badly as they did. We do have more modern comforts, but we do have to keep in mind that it's not very we're not very far from destruction, we're not very far from tyranny, and we're not very far from we're not very far from the end of history as we understand it, whether it be by natural disaster or by our own hands. However, there is, with being at the end of history, a certain sense of hope. We do have the ability to progress, to move on, to redefine ourselves continually. And in our age of information and technology, we have a certain obligation to empathize, to understand where other people are coming from, and to be good to not only ourselves but the environment around us. We always have to remember that life is extraordinarily fragile, and in our era of technology, we have ways of destroying ourselves much more readily than we did back then. And it's arguable to say that we're even closer to the end of history than we ever have been in the past. And so it's important to remember that the study of humanities is a study in empathy. To empathize is to be a part of the human race, to be a better person. And with that, I want to say that it's been a nice term. I've enjoyed our class discussions, and I've enjoyed the class overall, even if I mostly just signed up for the modernists period, which lasted disappointingly short, but understandably in the overall syllabus. Finn is the little character that I drew. It's a sort of a self-portrait. I like to draw comics, and I really have a hard time taking things seriously for very long. So I hope you enjoyed the little joke here.